After surviving a fall into the river that everyone insisted was just an accident, I moved in with my daughter's family to recover. But the very next morning, my granddaughter quietly appeared beside my bed and whispered, "Grandpa, you need to leave this house." I asked her why. She squeezed my hand tightly, led me to the air vent in the wall, and said in a trembling voice, "Look." I leaned closer and peered inside, and froze when I saw something horrifying blinking right in front of my eyes. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And tell me this, if your grandchild whispered a warning like that to you, would you stay in the house or leave immediately? Just a quick note, the story you're about to hear is a fictional narrative, dramatized for storytelling and created to explore meaningful themes. The Ashley River doesn't simply flow, it devours. When the icy current forced its way into my lungs, I understood something that chilled me more than the water itself. The man I had called my son for 5 years had finally stopped pretending to care whether I lived or died. My name is Dorian Rowan. I'm a 68-year-old retired architect with silver hair and a mind that still sees the world through blueprints and load-bearing lines. On that quiet May morning in 2022, I stood beside the Ashley River, unaware that the life I had built so carefully was about to be dismantled piece by piece. For most of my life, I believed in the logic of structure. At the university where I taught, I often told my students that a strong foundation is rarely noticed until the storm arrives. Only then do people realize what has been holding everything up. What I failed to see was the rot spreading quietly inside my own home. The Charleston Promenade had always been my refuge. The steady rhythm of water against stone calmed my thoughts, offering a predictable geometry to the day. The humid air was already thick that morning, carrying the sharp scent of salt and marsh water. Yet I felt strangely peaceful. I watched the early sunlight shimmer across the river's surface, and thought about the drafting table waiting for me at home. There were sketches spread across it, plans for a community center that still needed refinement. My life had always felt like a series of precise lines and reinforced beams. Even as age settled into my knees, my mind remained as sharp as a laser level. Then, a shadow fell across the path in front of me. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who sits at your dinner table and suddenly realized they might be calculating your funeral? That realization struck me only when Magnus Harlow. He stepped into view. Magnus was 41, dressed in expensive running gear that looked oddly polished against the quiet morning mist. As a hedge fund manager, he moved with the confident ease of someone used to controlling rooms and conversations. Standing there on the promenade, he looked vibrant and energetic, completely out of place in the stillness of my morning walk. He smiled when he approached me, but it was the kind of smile that only covered the surface. It never reached his eyes. "You look tired, Dorian," he said lightly, his voice carrying a tone of rehearsed concern that made the back of my neck prickle. "Maybe these walks are getting a little too much for someone your age." I turned to Harlow, him gripping the cold, rust-spotted railing that bordered the riverwalk. "I've never felt sharper," I replied evenly. My voice remained steady, the way a properly designed beam holds firm under pressure. "Can you say the same about your fund?" I had heard the rumors about his financial troubles, quiet whispers of heavy losses and failing investments. Small cracks in the empire he'd like to pretend was indestructible. But I didn't expect the atmosphere between us to shift so suddenly. His expression hardened. In that moment, the polite mask of the devoted son-in-law slipped, revealing something colder beneath. Then it happened. No warning, no argument, just a sudden shove. Gravity did the rest. The railing gave way beneath my weight, not because it was old, but because someone had tampered with it. The bolts had been loosened by hands that knew my routine. I plunged into the river with a brutal shock that stole the breath from my lungs. The Ashley River felt like a frozen grave. My soaked clothes dragged me down Harlow, as if the water itself wanted to claim me. Salt burned through my throat and chest as I struggled for air. I tried to fight up Harlow, clawing to Harlow the surface, but the current felt impossibly heavy, like a giant hand pressing me deeper into the dark silt below. My vision dimmed. The world began closing in. Then suddenly something grabbed my collar. A powerful arm hauled me up Harlow. Jim Rodriguez, a 28-year-old competitive swimmer, dragged me to Harlow the muddy bank. His lean, muscular frame moved with the strength and precision of someone used to fighting the water. His wetsuit dripped river water as he pulled me onto the shore. "Stay with me, sir. Breathe," he shouted urgently. I gasped violently, coughing river water onto the ground as my lungs fought to recover. My vision blurred between sunlight and shadows. Through the haze, I looked back to Harlow the promenade. Magnus was still there, but he wasn't rushing for help. He was checking his watch. Jim followed my gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I saw him up there," Jim said quietly between breaths. "Someone was standing near you before you fell." But Magnus had already begun moving. By the time we looked again, his phone was pressed to his ear. His voice echoed across the water, loud and frantic. "Help, my father-in-law fell into the river. Please send an ambulance." The performance had already started, and I was far too weak to tell anyone the truth. The wail of the ambulance siren tore through the quiet morning like a jagged blade, but it wasn't the sound of approaching help that chilled me. It was the silence of the man standing above me. Magnus didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. Instead, he stepped deeper into the scene, weaving himself directly into the rescue, as if he belonged there, using concern as armor, while he quietly seized control of the story before anyone else could speak. I lay sprawled on the muddy riverbank, gasping for air that burned through my lungs like liquid fire. Each breath scraped painfully against my throat, thick with river water and silt. The paramedics rushed down the slope to Harlow U.S. boots, sliding against wet grass as their equipment rattled. Magnus stepped for Harlow to meet them. His face twisted into a perfect imitation of panic. "Oh God, Dorian!" He shouted loud enough for every responder within 20 yards to hear. I only looked away for a second. "How did you trip?" His voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. I tried to answer, but my throat felt like an empty cavern filled with salt and grit. The metallic taste of blood spread across my tongue as I struggled to form words. Nearby, Jim Rodriguez stood beside the gurney, watching everything with narrowed eyes. The young swimmer who had pulled me from the river wasn't buying the performance. "He didn't trip," Jim said firmly, pointing a rough, calloused finger to Harlow, the promenade above us. I saw someone standing near him. For the first time, suspicion flickered in the air, but Magnus moved quickly. He stepped directly into Jim's line of sight, raising a hand to wave a medic closer. "Please, he's in shock," Magnus said urgently, his voice dripping with practiced grief. "Focus on his breathing. He's been unsteady lately." The words landed with surgical precision. Suddenly, the attention shifted from a possible attack to an elderly man who had simply lost his balance. A thick wool blanket was wrapped around my shaking body as the paramedics lifted me onto the stretcher. My muscles trembled uncontrollably, the cold digging deep into my bones. Inside, my chest rage burned hotter than the pain, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there and watch Magnus steal the truth before it even had a chance to breathe. The ambulance ride felt like being buried alive inside a flashing metal coffin. Neon lights flickered overhead as the vehicle bounced down the road. The smell of ozone antiseptic and rubbing alcohol filled the cramped compartment, while the rhythmic thud of the tires against pavement echoed through my skull. And sitting beside me was the man who had just tried to kill me. Magnus leaned for Harlow, his shadow swallowing the flickering light. "Save your strength, Dad," he murmured softly, his voice calm and almost comforting. His face hovered inches from mine. "You're confused. Just breathe." His hand rested on my arm like a caring relative. I clawed weakly at his sleeve, my fingers scraping across the expensive fabric. Pushed, I croaked. The word barely escaped my throat, but the engine roared louder, drowning the sound. "He's unstable," one of the paramedics said, checking the monitor beside me. "Vitals are erratic." My terror was mistaken for medical distress. In that moment, I understood something horrifying. Imagine realizing the person who just tried to murder you is the same person the entire world believes is protecting you. The ambulance doors burst open when we reached Charleston Medical Center. Everything after that blurred together. Bright fluorescent lights stabbed at my eyes as hospital staff rushed around me. The smell of disinfectant flooded the air, while voices overlapped in a frantic chorus. They wheeled me through hallways that stretched endlessly beneath sterile white ceilings. Magnus stayed behind for a moment near the admissions desk. I could hear his voice drifting through the open trauma bay door as the nurses prepared my bed. "He's 68, Magnus explained gently. But lately he's been acting much older than that. I was afraid something like this might happen. The poison was already spreading. By the time the doctors began examining me, Magnus had quietly planted the first seeds of doubt. Not attempted murder, just an aging man losing his balance. The curtain closed around my hospital bed, sealing me inside a bright cage of plastic and metal. For a moment, the room fell silent. Then Magnus stepped inside. He leaned close, too close. The smell of expensive espresso clung to his breath as he bent to Harlow my ear, and for the first time since the river, I saw his real face. Not the charming investor, not the devoted son-in-law, just the predator hiding underneath. "It's a long way down, Dorian," he whispered. His voice was as cold as the river silt. "You should have stayed under." The steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor echoed through the hospital room like a cruel countdown. Each sound felt like a digital metronome, marking the seconds until someone officially declared that my mind, my independence, was gone. There is a special kind of terror in knowing you are completely sane while the world around you is calmly, professionally deciding that you are not. I lay trapped in the narrow ER bed, the thin plastic hospital bracelet digging into my wrist. My body felt weak, heavy with exhaustion and medication. At the foot of the bed stood Magnus. He wasn't watching me, he was watching the doctor. Dr. Aris Thorne, the neurologist assigned to evaluate me, stood beside my chart. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried himself with the quiet detachment of a man who spent his days analyzing damaged minds. His voice had the sterile calm of surgical steel. He looked down at the tablet in his hands the way an engineer might examine a malfunctioning machine. Magnus's performance began again. "He's been forgetting things lately," Dr. Magnus said softly. His voice carried a careful mixture of concern and sorrow. Names, dates, little details. He paused, lowering his tone as if sharing something confidential. "Last week he thought it was 1995. I think the fall into the river was just the breaking point. Every word was perfectly placed. I tried to speak, I tried to tell the truth, but when I forced the air from my lungs, the sound that escaped my throat was nothing more than a ragged wheeze. That's a lie," I croaked weakly. My mouth felt like dry cotton. The sedatives in my bloodstream made my tongue feel thick and slow. I remember I struggled to say. He pushed me. I remember his hands. Magnus let out a soft sigh. It was the sound of patient disappointment, the kind a loving relative might make when dealing with someone confused. The doctor glanced to Harlow him sympathetically. "You see," Magnus murmured gently. "He's agitated, hallucinating. It's probably the shock." Dr. Thorne stepped closer to the bed. The faint scent of floor wax and stale hospital air clung to his lab coat. He leaned in to examine my eyes, shining a small penlight across my pupils. He didn't look at the fear in my face. He only looked at the data. In that moment, I realized something chilling. If a man loses his home, people feel sorry for him. But if a man loses his mind, people quietly begin planning what to do with him. Which one do you think the world finds easier to dispose of? The doctor began asking questions. "Dorian," he said calmly, "can you tell me who the president is?" Of course I knew the answer, but as I opened my mouth, the room suddenly tilted. The fluorescent lights overhead stretched into long, white streaks as dizziness washed through my skull. "My head?" I muttered weakly. "It's spinning." I forced my eyes to Harlow him. "Why won't you listen about Magnus?" The doctor tapped something into his tablet. His expression carried polite pity. Strangely, that look hurt more than the river water that had burned through my lungs earlier that morning. Then it hit me, the sedative. The medication the nurse had given me earlier wasn't standard. Magnus must have whispered something to the staff, perhaps suggesting I had become violent or unstable. That would explain the dosage. He had ensured I would be too drugged to defend myself during the evaluation. My thoughts began slipping away like architectural drawings left out in the rain. Lines blurred. Structures dissolved. Memories lost their sharp edges. By the time Dr. Thorne finished his questions and left the room, I was sinking deeper into a fog of chemicals. The door opened softly. Magnus lingered for a moment in the doorway, his tall silhouette framed by the dim hospital lights. "Sleep well, Dad," he said quietly. The lights in the room dimmed. The door closed behind him. I stared up at the square acoustic tiles covering the ceiling, trying desperately to reconstruct the events of the morning with the careful precision I had once used to design buildings. I had designed skyscrapers that could withstand hurricanes. So how was it possible that my own life was collapsing this easily? My fingers moved weakly to Harlow, the plastic hospital band around my wrist. As I adjusted it, something brushed against my skin. A tiny piece of folded paper. Confused, I pulled it free with trembling fingers. The paper was crumpled and soft, as if someone had hidden it quickly. I squinted at the messy handwriting. It wasn't from a doctor. It was from Milo. "I saw him leave early," the note read. "He didn't have his running shoes on. For a moment, the room fell silent around me. That small message from my grandson felt like a fragile lifeline thrown into a sea of lies. But it also confirmed something far more terrifying. The attack at the river hadn't been the end of Magnus's plan. It was only the beginning. The hunt hadn't stopped outside. It had simply followed me inside the house. The small scrap of paper Milo had slipped to me stayed hidden in the palm of my hand, its crumpled edges pressing against my skin like a shard of truth, cutting through the chemical fog clouding my mind. Most people associate freedom with discharge papers and hospital doors opening behind them. But the moment the orderly locked the wheels of my chair into place, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't being released. I was simply being transferred. The sharp scent of antiseptic clung to my clothes like a second skin, a reminder of the sterile walls that had just failed to protect me. Across the room stood my daughter, Celeste Harlow. At 40 years old, she carried herself with the careful polish of someone whose life revolved around appearances. As a successful interior designer, she curated spaces the way others curated art galleries. Even here, pacing across the hospital room, she looked as composed as one of her own projects. Yet the expression in her eyes betrayed something deeper, pity, and something that looked suspiciously like guilt. Her fingers moved nervously along the edge of a silk scarf wrapped around her neck, an accessory that likely cost more than my first drafting table. "I'm calling a cab," I said hoarsely. My throat still felt raw from the river water. "I'm going home." My house on Trad Street had stood in Charleston longer than most of the buildings around it. I had renovated every beam, measured every wall, restored every detail. I built that house with my own hands. "Celeste," I continued, "I'm going back there." She didn't even hesitate. "Dad, you almost drowned?" she replied softly, her tone carrying the artificial calm of someone speaking to a child. "The doctor says you're not fully oriented. You're coming to stay with us in Mount Pleasant." That was when I noticed the folder tucked inside her handbag. Legal documents. The words, "Temporary Emergency Guardianship," appeared across the top of the page. My stomach dropped. She had already filed the paperwork. My supposed confusion after the river had become the evidence needed to strip away control of my own life. The hospital gown draped over my shoulders suddenly felt less like clothing and more like a white flag, a forced surrender. Every brick I had laid in this city, every foundation I had built, reduced to a legal argument about my declining competence. I wanted to shout. I wanted to remind them that I had designed buildings that still stood after hurricanes. But the medication in my system made my tongue feel like soaked timber, heavy, useless. Celeste gently helped me into the passenger seat of her luxury SUV. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud. The sound sealed me off from the outside world. As we pulled away from the hospital, the familiar streets of Charleston slid past the window in slow, blurry motion. Inside the vehicle, the recycled air from the climate system smelled faintly of leather and artificial citrus. I reached into my pocket. My phone. I needed to call Jim Rodriguez. He had seen Magnus near the railing. He was the only witness who might believe me. But when I pulled the phone out, I stared down at nothing more than a dead piece of glass. The screen was shattered. The battery was completely drained. Convenient damage that must have happened during the chaos of my hospital admission, or perhaps before. "Where's my phone, Celeste?" I asked quietly. The isolation began settling deep into my chest. "It's broken, Dad," she replied without looking away from the road. "Magnus took it to get fixed." Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Just relax and look at the view," she added softly. "Charleston is beautiful this time of year. Funny how the people who claim to care about you the most always know exactly which emotional pressure points to press." We crossed the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge a few minutes later. The vibration of the tires hummed through the seat beneath me as the sunlight reflected sharply off the Cooper River below. I looked down at the water, the same water that had almost become my grave, and I realized something unsettling. With every mile we drove across that bridge, I was moving further away from the witnesses of my life. Celeste's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, too tightly. Her knuckles had turned pale against the leather. "You're shaking," I said quietly. "Is everything all right at home?" She didn't answer immediately. "Everything is perfect," she whispered at last. Her voice sounded thin and strained. "It has to be." The words lingered in the air between us. When we turned into the driveway of the Mount Pleasant estate, I noticed something immediately. A professional security van was just pulling away from the property. Magnus had been busy while I was in the hospital, The large iron gates behind us slid shut with a heavy metallic click. The sound echoed with chilling finality, like the bolt of a prison door locking into place. And standing on the front porch waiting for our arrival was Magnus Harlow. He greeted us with a smile, but his eyes held no warmth at all. The scent of jasmine in Mount Pleasant was thick enough to suffocate a man. Its sweetness hung heavily in the humid air, a perfume so overpowering it felt almost deliberate, as if it existed to hide the darker smells beneath it. Stagnant water, old wood, rotting secrets buried inside the walls. As the iron gates behind us clanged shut, the sound echoed through the courtyard with chilling finality. Magnus's hand settled on my shoulder. The grip was firm, too firm. It wasn't the reassuring touch of a caring son-in-law. It felt more like the possessive pressure of someone claiming ownership over property that now belonged to him. He guided me slowly to Harlow the house. We climbed the polished staircase together, passing the master suites on the second floor. Each room looked immaculate, every surface arranged with the careful precision that Celeste had built her career around. The house carried the unmistakable signature of her design work. Soft lighting, curated furniture, expensive textures that suggested calm and luxury. But none of it felt warm. It felt staged. Magnus continued leading me up Harlow until we reached the third floor. At the end of the hallway sat a converted attic room. "We thought you'd appreciate the privacy up here," Dorian Magnus said smoothly. His voice was as polished as marble, away from the noise of the kids. I stepped inside and slowly surveyed the space. Old habits die hard. Even after retirement, my architect's instincts automatically began cataloging every structural detail of the room. The ceiling angles, the ventilation, the molding, the wiring. Privacy, I said quietly. My gaze settled on the crown molding near the ceiling, or just a better viewing angle for those cameras. I pointed to Harlow the small lenses hidden within the decorative woodwork. They were discreet, high-end, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Magnus didn't even blink. He simply placed my small travel bag on a chair beside the bed. The chair smelled strongly of fresh paint. Too strongly. The sharp chemical scent caught in the back of my throat immediately. It was the unmistakable odor of industrial solvent, the kind used to strip old lead-based coatings. Strange choice for a newly renovated space. The fumes stung my nose and triggered the beginnings of a dull pressure behind my eyes. Exactly the kind of headache that could easily be mistaken for cognitive confusion. Exactly the kind of symptom Magnus would want documented. I stood there on the cold hardwood floor, feeling the house slowly tighten around me. It was a trap, not an improvised one, a carefully designed system. Magnus's hospitality reminded me of a velvet glove wrapped around brass knuckles. It looked gentle on the surface, but every time his hand touched my shoulder, I could feel the bruising weight of his real intentions. Later that evening, we sat around the dining table. "We value routine in this house," Dad Magnus announced calmly. "It helps everyone stay focused." The expensive steak on my plate was over-salted. The flavor coated my tongue unpleasantly as I studied the people seated across from me. My grandson Milo sat stiffly in his chair. At 12 years old, he already carried the same sharp gaze I once saw in my own mirror. Tonight his posture was rigid, his shoulders tight as if every muscle in his body was holding itself perfectly still. His eyes flickered occasionally to Harlow, the corners of the room. To Harlow, the security sensors. Beside him, 8-year-old Lark gripped her fork tightly. She wasn't looking at her plate. She was watching her father, and the look in her eyes held far more understanding than any child should ever possess. Focused on what Magnus, I asked calmly. The chemical haze from the attic room was beginning to cloud the edges of my thoughts. The next quarterly report, or the next accident. Celeste immediately lowered her gaze. Her silence was a structural pillar supporting Magnus's performance. The tension in the room vibrated like an electrical hum. Even the quiet ventilation system pushing air through the house seemed to echo the strain. Then I noticed something else. The door behind me, specifically the space where the lock should have been. A hollow indentation in the wood. The lock had been removed. I wasn't a guest in this house. I was an exhibit. After dinner, Magnus intercepted me in the upstairs hallway. He handed me a printed document, a schedule. The page outlined daily routines, cognitive exercises, rest periods, supervised walks. The layout looked eerily similar to a correctional facility timetable. "It's for your safety," Dorian Magnus said lightly. His smile never reached his eyes. "In case you wander during one of your episodes." He gestured casually to Harlow, my bedroom door. The missing lock had been replaced with a simple exterior latch. a latch that could only be controlled from the outside. I stepped into the room slowly. Behind me, the hallway cameras shifted with soft, mechanical clicks as they adjusted their focus. The sound followed me like a persistent insect. As I began to close the door, movement caught my attention. Down the hall, Lark stood quietly in the dim light of the nursery wing. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. Instead, she placed one finger gently against her lips. Then she pointed up Harlow. To Harlow, the ceiling. To Harlow, the metal ventilation grate above my bed. I followed her gesture and stared at the slats of the vent as the air system hummed softly through the house. In that moment, the truth settled heavily in my chest. I wasn't just being watched, I was being listened to. The nightmare didn't end when I opened my eyes that night. It simply changed shape. The freezing water of the Ashley River was gone, replaced by the suffocating silence of a house that seemed to be quietly preparing for my death. I lay awake in the attic room on the third floor, staring into the darkness. My lungs still felt heavy, as if the river's silt had never truly left them. Each breath carried a dull ache that reminded me how close I had come to never breathing again. Above me, the metal ventilation grate hummed steadily. At first, the sound seemed harmless, a low, mechanical vibration, like any ordinary HVAC system. But the rhythm was too consistent, too controlled. It was deliberate. After decades of designing buildings, you learn to recognize how sound travels through structure. A house like this should have subtle variations in airflow, but the hum above my head was perfectly even. White noise, a generator. Someone had installed it intentionally. The device masked every sound traveling through the vents, turning the entire upper floor into a carefully insulated chamber. Conversations, footsteps, doors opening and closing, everything below would vanish into that steady mechanical hum. It was brilliant engineering and terrifying. It meant Magnus and Celeste could move freely through the house, finalize whatever plans they were making, and I would never hear a thing. The chemical smell in the room grew stronger as the night deepened. The sharp bite of industrial solvent clung to the walls, mixing with the warm midnight air. It irritated my throat and made my temples pulse with a dull ache. My thoughts began scattering into uneven fragments. Exactly what Magnus wanted. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to focus. Walls don't just speak, I whispered quietly to the empty room. They record. Closing my eyes, I began mapping the house in my mind the way I once mapped architectural projects. The ductwork, the beams, the staircases, every reinforced floorboard. I searched for weaknesses the way an engineer studies a flawed design. There had to be a flaw somewhere. A soft metallic click interrupted my thoughts. I froze. The sound came from the door, the latch. Someone was opening it from the outside. My heart began pounding against my ribs as the door slowly eased open. A small figure slipped inside. Moonlight from the hallway framed his silhouette. "Milo," I whispered. My grandson stepped quietly to Harlow, the bed clutching a small electronic device in his trembling hands. He moved like a shadow, every step careful and deliberate. When he reached me, he leaned close. "Grandpa, don't make a sound," he breathed. His voice was barely audible above the white noise humming through the vents. The vents. "He can hear your breathing." I sat up slowly. "Milo." "What are you doing here?" I whispered. I reached out and touched his arm. The boy was shaking. "Badly." "You're freezing, son." He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my hand with fingers so cold they felt like ice. "You have to see the papers," he said urgently. "He thinks you're too confused to notice. But he's moving everything." His voice trembled. "He's taking everything away." How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the man who gave him his last name is the same man trying to erase yours from existence? I didn't have the words. So instead, I nodded. Milo led me quietly out of the room. What terrified me most wasn't the danger. It was how confidently he moved through it. He knew exactly which floorboards creaked, which corners held motion sensors, which steps to avoid. Magnus had built a surveillance system throughout the house, but Milo navigated it like someone who had memorized the entire map. We moved through the dark hallway in silence, down the staircase, to Harlow, the second floor. Below us, the deep ticking of a grandfather clock echoed through the house. Each slow tick sounded like a heartbeat counting down our time. We stopped in front of a heavy mahogany door, Magnus's office. The door he kept triple locked. Milo reached into his pocket and produced a small key. "I took it from his gym bag," he whispered. My chest tightened. The boy slid the key into the lock. The metal turned slowly. The sound it made echoed like something ancient and final, not the sound of a door opening, the sound of a vault unlocking, or a grave being disturbed. "He stays in here every night until 4, Milo whispered. "We have 20 minutes. He pushed the door open carefully. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood turn colder than the river water. Milo was wearing running shoes, bright neon-trimmed running shoes. The same pair Magnus claimed he had been wearing during his morning jog, the jog where he supposedly found me falling into the river. But Milo wasn't hearing about the accident secondhand. He had seen it. He had been there. My grandson tightened his grip on my hand as we stepped into the office. The room glowed with the cold blue light of 3 computer monitors. Their screens illuminated a large desk covered in neatly organized folders, every one of them labeled with my name. Stepping into Magnus's office felt like walking into the aftermath of a crime that hadn't technically happened yet, a room where my entire life had already been dissected, analyzed, and reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. The door closed softly behind Milo and me. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air, heavy and bitter. On the desk sat a folder labeled with my social security number. Seeing it there made my stomach twist. I opened the first folder I saw. Inside was something even worse, a contingency file. The date printed on the first page froze my blood. 6 months ago. This plan had not been created in a moment of rage or desperation. The attempt to drown me in the Ashley River had been carefully prepared, structured like a long-term investment strategy. Magnus hadn't acted impulsively. He had designed it. The office itself was illuminated by the eerie blue glow of 3 enormous computer monitors. Their cold light reflected off Milo's glasses as he stood beside me, nervously watching the hallway through the partially open door. Somewhere behind the desk, a hard drive hummed quietly. The sound was steady, mechanical, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the room. I turned my attention to Harlow the screens. What I saw there told a different story than the confident image Magnus presented at dinner every night. The computer was connected to a private server for his hedge fund, but the numbers weren't rising. They were collapsing. The graphs on the screen bled red. Investor capital had plummeted, leaving behind a jagged crimson line that dropped lower with every passing week. It was a financial freefall. The empire Magnus had spent years pretending to build was crumbling. Milo gently pointed to Harlow, a drawer beneath the desk. Unlike the other furniture in the office, this drawer was reinforced with steel. Its construction looked out of place inside the elegant mahogany desk. "He spends hours in here every night," Milo whispered. His voice trembled slightly. "He's not looking at the stocks when he comes in here." Milo swallowed. "He's looking at that." I glanced again at the bleeding financial charts on the monitor and shook my head slowly. "These numbers are hemorrhaging," I said quietly. "This isn't an investment fund anymore. It's a furnace." I reached down and pulled open the steel drawer. The metal handle felt cold against my skin. Inside were rows of meticulously organized files. Looking through them felt like witnessing my own autopsy while my heart was still beating. Every document told a story. My story. I lifted out a thick leather folder that felt strangely heavy in my hands. This wasn't just a business file. It was an archive of my life. When I opened it, the faint papery scent of old architectural drawings drifted into the air. Blueprints, original ones. "Why does he have my designs from 1985? I murmured. The pages showed early drafts of the Charleston Library project I had worked on decades ago. My handwriting, my measurements, my notes. Beside me, Milo watched anxiously. "He says he's protecting the family assets," Milo said softly. "But he's been selling things." I didn't answer. Instead, I continued digging through the drawer. At the very bottom sat a red folder. The label printed across its front made my heart stutter. Dorian Rowan Contingency Plan, Phase 2. I pulled it out slowly. My hands trembled slightly. Inside the folder sat a neatly printed insurance policy, a massive one. The number printed on the page glared back at me. $3,500,000. Magnus Harlow was listed as the sole beneficiary. My breath caught. Beneath the insurance policy was another document, a power of attorney. My eyes immediately went to the signature line. I stared at it, then I shook my head. "That's not my signature," I whispered. "I never signed this." The forgery was almost perfect. The pen strokes mimicked my handwriting with unsettling precision. But I knew every line of my own signature. This one was wrong. My gaze moved to the bottom of the document. The notary seal was stamped in gold foil. The name printed beneath it drained the air from my lungs. Marcus Webb. The date of notarization made my hands begin to shake. It was the day before my wife Helen's funeral. That had been one of the darkest days of my life. I had barely been able to function. Magnus had disappeared from the house for nearly an hour that afternoon. At the time, I had assumed he was simply running errands. Now, the truth stared back at me from the paper. Marcus Webb. The name triggered a memory. Sudden. Cold. A man I had seen briefly at the hospital earlier that day, standing in the hallway beside Celeste. He hadn't been wearing a doctor's coat. He hadn't been medical staff at all. The realization settled heavily in my chest. My family hadn't simply fallen apart. It had been carefully engineered, rigged like a building scheduled for demolition, and Magnus had already pushed the detonator halfway down. The memory of the man Celeste had spoken to at the hospital, Marcus Webb, sent a chill through me that the office's air conditioning couldn't match. Marcus Webb. 52 was a man with the stillness of a maritime lawyer who knew exactly where the bodies were buried and how to keep them there. Have you ever found the price tag for your own murder hidden among the family photos? I dug deeper into the contingency folder while Milo stood guard, his eyes darting to Harlow, the office door. The $3.5 million policy wasn't just a document, it was a blueprint for my liquidation. I traced the premium payments and found they were being funneled through a shell company linked directly to Magnus's failing fund. The accidental drowning rider would double the payout, a detail that turned my stomach. Grandpa, look at the dates, Milo whispered, his voice cracking. These withdrawals, they started the month Mom and Dad bought this house. I stared at a secondary ledger Milo had pulled from the stack. My daughter Celeste hadn't just been a passive observer. Her signature appeared on several withdrawal slips from my private retirement accounts totaling nearly $500,000. They didn't just want me dead, Milo. They've already started eating my ghost. The betrayal was a structural failure, a load-bearing wall of my life crumbling in real time. My rage was cold and calculating, an architect's anger at a sabotaged design. I turned the page and found something even more sinister, a structural survey of the Ashley River Promenade railing. 180 pounds, the exact weight of a man's life when measured by his son-in-law. The report included a marked section where the bolts had been corroded with acid to ensure they would give way under my exact weight. I recognized the architectural notations on the margin, the precise sloping script of someone who had used my own drafting tools to plan my execution. He used my own formulas to calculate my death. I whispered, the paper crinkling under my white-knuckled grip. Don't ever think your family won't kill you. Sometimes they just haven't seen the right balance sheet yet. The smell of ozone from the computer towers seemed to sharpen as I reached into the back of the drawer frame. My fingers brushed against a small, high-end digital recorder tucked behind the wood. I turned it on, the tiny rhythmic click sounding like a heartbeat in the silence. I heard my own voice from the hospital, but it was wrong. It was heavily edited, my words spliced together to make me sound incoherent and aggressive. Magnus had been manufacturing the evidence for my competency hearing, cutting my words, until I sounded like a man who had lost his grip on the world. That's not what I said, I told Milo, my eyes stinging. He's cutting the words out. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital files and found one dated months before the river. It was titled, Trial Run. My heart stopped. This wasn't the first time they'd tried. Grandpa, the light on the door, someone's coming. Milo hissed, his hand grabbing my shoulder. The red laser of the security sensor on the door frame suddenly blinked green, and the heavy thud of a footstep echoed in the hallway right outside. I shoved the recorder into my pocket, the cold sweat prickling at my hairline, as the shadow of a man fell across the frosted glass of the office door. Shadows don't just hide secrets. They breathe, and as the floorboard outside the office groaned, I realized the man who wanted my life was only inches away from ending it. The heavy thud of a footstep behind the mahogany door sent a jolt of adrenaline through my aged frame. I grabbed Milo by the shoulder, my fingers digging into his thin shirt, and pulled him to Harlow, the knee-hole of the massive desk. We scrambled into the narrow space, tucking our legs tight against the cold, unyielding wood as the handle turned with a sharp metallic click. The office door swung open, and the room was suddenly filled with the heavy, cloying scent of expensive bourbon and fresh mint. Magnus entered the room, the rhythm of his dress shoes on the floor sounding like a countdown. He didn't turn on the overhead lights, relying instead on the blue flickering glow of the computer monitors that reflected off the dark walls like a digital haunting. I held my breath, my lungs burning from the effort, as his silhouette hovered directly above our hiding spot. "Don't breathe, Milo," I whispered in a voice so faint it was barely a thought. "Just be a shadow." I could hear the sharp rhythmic thud of what I imagined was Magnus's heart, though it was likely just the blood rushing through my own ears. He reached for a mouse, the clicking sound amplified in the absolute silence. "Just a few more days, Dorian," I heard him mutter to the empty air, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Then we can finally balance the books." He checked a single notification on the screen, his fingers tapping a restless beat on the desk surface just inches from my head before turning and leaving as quickly as he had arrived. The door closed and the lock engaged with a finality that left us in darkness. You think you know your family? You think blood is a bond. But in this house, blood was just the ink used to sign my death warrant. Once the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall, I crawled out, my hands trembling. My palm brushed against a hidden latch in the back of the desk drawer, a structural secret I hadn't noticed before. I pressed it, and a secondary compartment slid open. Inside was a ghost gallery. I stared at surveillance photos of two other women, Margaret Thornton of Savannah and Susan Whitfield of Atlanta. Taped to the back of the dry, papery death certificates were news clippings of tragic accidents involving water. "He didn't just target me, Milo," I whispered, showing him the photos. "This is a trophy room." My stomach turned when I saw the final detail, 3 gold wedding rings nestled in a velvet-lined corner of the drawer. He kept them like architectural souvenirs. "Grandpa, those ladies," Milo said, his voice small and hollow. "They look like they're sleeping in the water." The realization hit me harder than the river had. I wasn't just a victim, I was a project. The third building in a skyline of corpses. I picked up the digital recorder again and realized that the file labeled Trial Run wasn't a rehearsal of my death. It was a recording of Margaret Thornton's final gasping moments. Milo ushered me out of the office, his young face hardened by the horror we had uncovered. We navigated the dark hallway back to the 3rd floor, every creak sounding like an alarm. I collapsed onto my bed, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. "Go to bed, Milo. Lock your door. From now on, we play the part he wants." As the first light of dawn touched the window, I heard Magnus's voice from the hallway, cheerful and loud, calling me down for breakfast as if he hadn't just stood over my hiding spot with the soul of a reaper. Looking into the mirror that morning, I didn't see an architect. I saw an actor preparing for the most dangerous opening night of his life, where a single missed cue would mean a permanent curtain call. I deliberately chose mismatched socks and left my top shirt button dangling loose to reinforce the image of a man losing his grip on detail. I practiced a vacant, slightly confused expression in the glass, letting my jaw slacken just enough to look defeated. From below, I heard the cheerful sounds of a family breakfast, Celeste humming a soft tune, the distant muffled laughter of Lark. But to my ears, it sounded like a curated stage play designed by a predator. "Just a confused old man, Dorian," I whispered to my reflection. "Be the victim they want to see." As I descended the stairs, the vibration of the hall clock ticked like a heart monitor marking each step. I walked into the dining room, where the scent of heavy, humid gardenias drifted through the open window, a cloying floral smell that seemed too thick for the morning air. Celeste was serving bowls of expensive local berries, their dark juices staining the white porcelain. I realized then that the fruit was laced with the same chemical irritant from the room paint, an overly sweet chemical aftertaste clinging to the edges of the flavor. It was a subtle toxin designed to induce the very fogginess Magnus was so eager to document. Magnus was seated at the head of the table, his perfectly manicured nails tapping a restless rhythm against the wood as he skimmed a digital paper. He greeted me with a cheerful tone that didn't match the cold thud of the footsteps I had heard outside his office hours earlier. "Did you hear the house settling last night, Dorian?" He asked, his eyes never leaving the screen. "I thought I heard footsteps on the 2nd floor around 3. I paused, letting a flicker of faux panic cross my face as I sat down. I had a dream about the River Magnus. I think I got up for water, but I couldn't find the kitchen. The stairs, they keep moving on me. Have you ever sat across from your own flesh and blood and watched them wait for you to fail, like vultures circling a dying animal in a $5,000 dining room across from me? Milo sat rigidly, barely touching his food, his eyes fixed on his plate to avoid betraying our shared secret. Magnus leaned in, testing me. "Remember, we talked about selling your drafting table yesterday, Dad. You agreed it was just taking up space. It was a lie, a fictional conversation from a day that never happened. Did I asked, my voice thin. "Yes. I suppose everything is taking up space lately." I saw the triumphant glint in his eyes. a hunter who believed his prey was finally cornered. He was recording me. Every stutter, every staged lapse. I was building his case with every breath. As Magnus stood to leave for work, he handed Celeste a small digital device. I recognized instantly it was the recorder from the office, and it was already running, capturing my every confused word. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back at me with a look of predatory pity that made my skin crawl. "Don't worry, Dorian. We're going to get you the help you need today. Real help." I closed the bedroom door and leaned against it, the staged tremor in my hands finally becoming real as the adrenaline from the dining room began to drain away. The silence of the attic room pressed against my ears, like a physical weight, broken only by the faint hum of the white noise generator. I walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtain back, just enough to watch Magnus's luxury SUV disappear down the driveway. I realized then that the care plan Celeste mentioned wasn't just about my health. It included a provision for Magnus to begin the immediate liquidation of my firm's intellectual property. "They've built the cage, Dorian," I whispered to the empty room. "Now you have to find the one loose bolt." I immediately began a mental structural inventory of my situation, deconstructing the morning's performance like an architect reviewing a flawed blueprint. I had the evidence from the office, but I was physically isolated on the third floor, and legally being boxed in by the cognitive specialist Magnus was bringing over. The visual of dust motes dancing in the morning light seemed to mock my confinement. I reached into the secret compartment of my suitcase and pulled out a small velvet pouch. I could still smell the cedar from the trunk where it usually sat. I pulled out my wife, Helen's wedding ring, the cool, smooth weight of the gold, an anchor in my trembling palm. Grief is a heavy stone, but if you hold it right, it becomes a weapon. I turned the band over in my fingers, remembering the 45 years we spent building a life together in Charleston. This ring represented more than love. It was the physical anchor of the integrity Magnus was trying to steal from me. "I promised you I'd look after her. Helen," I muttered, my voice cracking. "But how do I save a daughter who's helping the man holding the knife?" I recalled the values we had instilled in Celeste, and the crushing guilt of not seeing Magnus's predator nature sooner threatened to overwhelm me. He isn't just taking my money, he's erasing the legacy I spent decades constructing. You never know the true strength of a structure until you try to tear it down. Magnus was about to find out exactly how deep my pilings went. I realized that my foundation was still solid, far stronger than the hollow greed he was built upon. I went to put the ring back, but my fingers brushed against something else in the bottom of the velvet pouch. Hidden inside, I found a small handwritten note from Helen, written shortly before she died. "Don't let our daughter lose her way in the shadows," it read. My heart stopped. She had suspected something about Magnus even then, a mother's intuition sensing the rot before the architect saw the cracks. I tucked the note away, my eyes hardening with a clarity that the sedative fruit couldn't touch. "A building only falls if the foundation is weak," I told the shadows. Mine isn't. I straightened my shirt, the tremor in my hands vanishing as a cold, calculating resolve took its place. The sharp, rhythmic knock on my door wasn't Milo's soft tap. It was the heavy, confident rap of someone who owned the room I was standing in. The metallic click of the latch echoed like a hammer strike, signaling the end of my temporary peace. My daughter didn't enter the room like a child coming to see her father. She entered like an inspector, evaluating a building already marked for demolition, her eyes scanning the walls as if searching for evidence that my mind had begun to crumble. The old hinges creaked as the door slowly opened. The sound echoed through my chest. Celeste stepped inside the room she had helped transform into a carefully disguised prison. She carried a small tea tray in both hands. The porcelain cups rattled softly against their saucers, creating a fragile, nervous rhythm that filled the silence. Her voice followed a moment later, soft, measured, carefully rehearsed. "Dad, we know you miss Mom," she said gently. She placed the tray down on the bedside table with the graceful precision of someone used to performing calm. "But you're seeing things that aren't there," she paused. "You're frightening the children." The faint scent of lavender perfume drifted through the air, mixed with the sterile sharpness of antiseptic soap. It felt nothing like the warm, spontaneous comfort my daughter once carried with her. This version of Celeste sounded like someone reading from a script. As she poured the tea, something slipped from her designer handbag. A manila envelope slid to the floor. It landed open. For a brief moment, I saw what was inside. Glossy photographs. 2 women, both strangers to me. They were smiling in the pictures, posing at charity galas and yacht clubs beneath elegant chandeliers. Before I could look closer, Celeste bent quickly to retrieve the envelope. But I had already noticed the writing on the back of one photograph, a short, handwritten message. They trusted him, too. The color drained from Celeste's face as she shoved the envelope back into her bag. "It's nothing, Dad," she said quickly, "just some old client files." Yet her hands shook so badly that the teacup rattled loudly against its saucer. Someone had been warning her, but she was either too frightened or too involved to acknowledge it. I slowly pushed myself upright in the bed. Helen's note still rested in my pocket, its presence warm against my leg like a small burning coal. "I miss her every second, Celeste," I said quietly. "But grief doesn't make a man imagine a hand shoving him into a river." She didn't react, not even a flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her eyes filled with a deep, sympathetic pity. The kind of pity reserved for someone already being mourned. She began talking about the months following Helen's death in 2020, about the emotional strain, about the loneliness. Slowly, carefully, she began suggesting that my mourning had evolved into something else, something permanent, a cognitive collapse. In that moment, I understood. She wasn't speaking as my daughter. She was repeating Magnus's script, every word, every argument. She had become the soft edge of the blade designed to cut me away from my own life. There is a unique pain in watching your own child weaponize the love you carry for your dead wife. Grief had become the lock on my prison door. As Celeste lifted the teapot again, the sleeve of her silk blouse slid back slightly. A new watch sparkled on her wrist. Diamond-studded, expensive. I recognized the design instantly. I had seen the purchase listed on Magnus's financial statements in his office. The money had come from my retirement account, blood money. Celeste noticed where I was looking and quickly pulled her sleeve back into place. She changed the subject immediately. "You remember the brunch we had 6 months ago?" she asked. "You didn't come?" Her voice carried quiet accusation. "You forgot completely." I said nothing, but inside my mind the pieces clicked together. They had been documenting everything, every missed appointment, every small mistake, every moment of grief. They had built a record of my supposed decline long before Magnus pushed me into the river. "Magnus says it's complex bereavement disorder," Celeste continued softly. "He's just trying to protect your legacy." I looked directly at her. "Is that what we're calling it now?" I asked calmly. "Protecting a legacy by locking the air inside a cage." She looked away, beautiful, perfectly composed, like fresh drywall covering a wall already rotting from the inside. Downstairs, the grandfather clock ticked loudly in the foyer. Each heavy second filled the silence between us. Celeste cleared her throat. "A cognitive specialist will be here within the hour," she said. "You just need to cooperate." She lifted the teacup to Harlow me. "Just tell the doctor the truth, Dad. Tell him how tired you feel." Then she stood. As she turned to Harlow, the door she reached for the small velvet pouch sitting on the nightstand. Inside was Helen's wedding ring. "I'll hold on to this," she said, "so you don't misplace it again." I watched her walk out of the room. My heart hardened quietly into something stronger than grief, something sharper. The door closed behind her with a soft click. A moment later, I noticed something she had forgotten. A single printed document rested on the chair beside the bed. I picked it up slowly. A symptom log. My eyes scanned the handwritten notes across the page. The handwriting wasn't Magnus's. It belonged to Marcus Webb. 3 words had been underlined: "Triggers Helen, the firm, the river." Beneath them sat one final instruction: aim for high agitation. The war for my mind had already begun, and the enemy was already inside the house. The professional brisk footsteps on the porch signaled the arrival of someone who intended to finish what the river had started. But for now, I had other ruins to inspect. I pocketed the symptom log, the paper feeling like a cold stone against my thigh, and descended to the kitchen. The room was bright, filled with the cheerful hum of a sub-zero refrigerator and the expensive aroma of dark roast coffee. But as I stood in the doorway, I realized I was looking at a theater of theft where my own daughter was the lead actress. Celeste was busy organizing a delivery of artisanal groceries, her movements sharp and jagged. I saw a stack of past due notices for the children's private school tuition hidden inside a heavy French cookbook, the red ink standing out against the white paper like a fresh wound. It seemed the financial collapse was closer than even Magnus's office files had suggested. I watched her for a moment, noticing the designer shoes she tried to hide behind the marble island and the new espresso machine that likely cost more than my first car. Her materialism had made her the perfect clay for Magnus to mold into a criminal accomplice. "That is a lot of groceries for 4 people. "Celeste," I said, my voice shedding its confused veneer. Magnus's fund must be doing better than the news suggests. She jumped her heels clattering on the polished floor. We just like quality, Dad. Don't worry about the receipts. I walked to the quartz countertop, the surface cold and smooth under my fingers. I saw the statements in the office, Celeste. $400,000 in credit card debt. Is that why you notarized those papers at the hospital? She froze her face, turning a sickly translucent pale. You were snooping. How dare you? You are supposed to be resting, not acting like a spy in my own home. She was a structure under immense stress, the load-bearing walls of her conscience, bowing under the weight of a lifestyle she could no longer afford. I abandoned the act entirely, my voice becoming the authoritative architect once again. Do you truly trust him, Celeste? Or are you just too afraid of the debt to look him in the eye? My heart broke for her, yet I couldn't ignore the rot. How many dinners can you buy with your father's soul before the taste of the food turns to ash in your mouth? Celeste exploded, then a defensive rant fueled by desperation. You are being paranoid. She screamed, using the very words from Marcus Webb's notes to shield herself from the truth. You're delusional. I am calling Magnus. You're clearly having another episode and need to be upstairs. She swept the expensive groceries into the sink with a frantic, destructive energy and stormed out of the room. As she fled, her phone slipped from her pocket and skittered across the marble. It landed face up the screen, flickering to life with a text from Magnus. I leaned over, my eyes narrowing as I read, "Is the old man quiet? Yet Webb says we need the signature by Friday, or the house is gone." I stood alone in the sterile brightness of the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound left. The text on Celeste's phone screen flickered out, but the words, "or the house is gone," remained burned into my vision. They weren't just killing me for profit, they were killing me for survival. Survival isn't just about outrunning a predator. It's about understanding the architecture of his past kills. And as Milo slipped me a thin, worn envelope in the hallway, I knew the blueprints of my own demise were finally within reach. The sound of the front door latch clicking earlier had signaled Celeste's retreat to the garden, but it was the shadow of Milo appearing in the service hallway that brought the real evidence. He stood there, chest heaving, his young face a mask of protective urgency that no child should have to wear. "He was going to throw these away, Grandpa Milo," whispered his voice barely audible over the hum of the house. "I saw them in the trash bag in his car." He handed me the envelope, and as I pulled out the first item, a dry cleaning receipt crinkled in my trembling hands. It was for a suit Magnus wore the day of my accident, marked with urgent notes about river mud and salt stains, despite his sworn statement to the police that he had never even touched the water. "You're a brave man, Milo," I said, tucking the paper into my pocket. "Go play in the yard now. Don't let them see you with me." I retreated to a dim corner of the living room, the humid air of the hallway still pressing against my skin like a physical threat. I opened my laptop, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the dark room, as I began a targeted search for the names I'd found in his office, Margaret Thornton and Susan Whitfield. Searching for these women was like scrolling through a catalog of ghosts, each one a structural failure in Magnus's soul that he'd patched over with stolen cash. The digital obituaries appeared one by one, chilling in their similarity. Margaret had died in a Savannah boating accident in 2015. Susan had drowned in a private pool in Atlanta in 2018. Both were wealthy, both were recently married to a man using a slightly different alias. But the photos Milo had recovered matched the digital portraits perfectly. Boating accident, private pool, Ashley River. "The water is his signature," I whispered to the empty room. My fingers were frantic on the keyboard as I began cross-referencing these dates with what I knew of Magnus's financial history. His boutique fund had suffered its first major loss in 2014, just months before Margaret's death. A second massive shortfall hit in 2017, leading directly to Susan's unfortunate accident. If the water always claimed them when the bank accounts ran dry, what did that mean for me? A man whose house was already being measured for its final sale. The current shortfall was $3.1 million, a debt so deep that my own end-of-life timeline had been accelerated to meet a hard Friday deadline. He's not just a killer, he's an actuary of murder. I'm the third quarter dividend. I felt a visceral disgust as I realized I was just a line item on a balance sheet. I scrolled down on Susan Whitfield's page only to find a final haunting detail. Her obituary mentioned a surviving stepson who had vanished after the inheritance was settled. It was a pattern of total erasure. I was staring at Susan's smiling face on the screen when the sharp rhythmic rattle of the front door handle shattered the silence. The shadow of Magnus's frame blocked out the afternoon sun through the frosted glass, and for a second, the world stood perfectly still. The laptop screen felt like a beacon in the dim living room, a glowing confession of my sanity that I had exactly 3 seconds to extinguish before my executioner walked through the door. I heard the heavy front door thudding open, accompanied by the chillingly calm voice of Magnus calling out my name. With a sharp click, I slammed the lid shut, the heat radiating from the laptop's underside, pressing against my palm like a brand. I immediately slumped into the armchair, fixing my gaze on a nearby floor lamp, with the vacant glassy stare I had practiced in the mirror. Magnus rounded the corner, his presence filling the room with an air of cold authority. He didn't speak at first. He walked straight to the coffee table and placed his hand on the laptop lid. "The laptop is warm, Dorian," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I thought you were napping." I let my jaw hang slightly, forcing a dry, sticky feeling into my throat. I was looking for the blueprints for the St. Jude steeple. I rambled, my voice thin and wavering, the one with the copper cap. "Do you have the copper, Magnus? We need it for the foundation." He looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and a darkening, predatory patience. His voice was like sandpaper on a fine mahogany finish, grating destructive and determined to strip away every layer of my dignity until nothing but the raw, vulnerable grain remained. "Celeste said you were shouting about money in the kitchen," he said, circling my chair like a wolf. "That's not like you, Dorian. It sounds like agitated paranoia." I looked at him, blinking slowly. "Money?" I asked, tilting my head. I was asking about the gardenias. They smell like the hospital, don't they?" I realized then that he wasn't just guessing. He had a remote access app on that laptop. He had seen my search history into Margaret and Susan in real time. That was why he was home early. He wasn't here to check on me. He was here to accelerate the end. A luxury sedan crunched over the gravel driveway, pulling up to the house, an hour ahead of the scheduled appointment. Have you ever seen your own death warrant being pulled out of a stranger's trunk, disguised as a real estate sign? I watched through the window as a man in a charcoal suit unloaded a "for sale" sign, the sharp metal stakes glinting in the afternoon light. The house was already on the market, and I hadn't even been declared incompetent yet. "The doctor is early," Magnus said, his smile sharpening into something lethal. "He's a private consultant recommended by Marcus Webb. He's very thorough, Dorian. He'll see right through the foundations." Through the window, I watched as a second man in a navy blazer stepped out of the sedan, pulling a heavy wooden stake from the trunk. It wasn't medical equipment, it was a real estate sign. The polished placard read, "Historic Charleston Property, coming soon," with a glossy photo of my Trad Street home. Magnus was already marketing my house, liquidating my life before the ink on the competency papers had even dried. The audacity was breathtaking. He hadn't just planned my death, he'd already spent the inheritance. The sign's metal stakes glinted in the afternoon sun like grave markers, a visual countdown to the moment I would be declared legally dead while still breathing. I felt a surge of panic-driven adrenaline. The dry cleaning receipt was still in my pocket, a physical piece of evidence that would destroy me if the consultant searched me. I had to pivot, and I had to do it now. The smell of expensive leather and rain on the consultant's coat seemed to drift into the room even before he entered. Magnus's hand clamped onto my elbow with the strength of a vice, pulling me to Harlow the study. "Time for your checkup, Dorian. Try to be coherent, your future depends on it." I allowed myself to be led, my mind racing to find a hiding place for the truth, while my body played the part of a crumbling ruin. The study door closed behind me with a sharp click that echoed like the bolt of a prison cell. In front of me sat a man whose entire profession revolved around quietly dismantling lives with nothing more than a clipboard and a calm voice. I settled into the high-backed leather chair, the dry scent of old books and fresh printer ink lingering in the air. Behind me stood Magnus, silent and watchful, like a guard overseeing an interrogation. The man across from me introduced himself as Dr. Sterling Hayes. He wore his medical credentials like armor and a suit that probably cost more than my yearly pension. His eyes studied me with the cold patience of a vulture circling something already half dead. My pulse pounded against my ribs, but I forced my face to remain dull and unfocused. If they wanted confusion, I would give it to them. As the evaluation began, I noticed something subtle but revealing. On Hayes' wrist sat a sleek watch. I immediately recognized an exclusive promotional piece from Magnus's hedge fund. Investors received them during high-level events. That single detail told me everything. He wasn't an independent doctor. He was part of Magnus's network. Dorian Hayes said smoothly, glancing at his tablet. "Can you tell me what you were looking for on the laptop this afternoon?" I coughed softly, letting the sound scrape through my throat. "Blueprints," I muttered vaguely. My gaze drifted to Harlow the window. Charleston. Built on unstable pilings, you know. Foundations shift. Hayes began guiding me through a series of cognitive tests. At first glance, they appeared routine, simple memory questions, coordination exercises, verbal responses. But the structure of the questions told a different story. They were carefully designed to provoke agitation. Each prompt nudged to Harlow paranoia, exactly the behavioral triggers Marcus Webb had written about in the symptom log. Every time Hayes tapped a note into his tablet, I could almost feel the invisible walls of my confinement rising higher. During one coordination test, I had to adjust my jacket sleeve. As I moved, the dry cleaning receipt Milo had slipped into my pocket nearly slid into view. My stomach dropped. I reacted instantly, nudging the paper with my shoe beneath the heavy mahogany desk, just as Hayes leaned for Harlow. He wasn't diagnosing me. He was measuring the height of the cage he planned to seal around me. His stethoscope touched my chest next. The metal felt cold and invasive. "Your eyes are quite bloodshot, Dorian," he observed calmly, leaning closer. "Are you having difficulty sleeping in this new house?" Of course he knew the answer he wanted. Evidence of instability, evidence of medication, evidence that I could no longer care for myself. "The paint," I murmured slowly, letting my voice wander. "It has a certain weight to it." My eyes drifted again. When someone is paid to believe you're insane, arguing your sanity only proves their point. So I did the only thing left. I let him believe he was winning. My attention shifted to the watch ticking quietly on his wrist. Each second felt like a countdown. Then Magnus stepped for Harlow. "Dinner's ready," he announced smoothly. A faint smile curled across his face. Hayes stood and snapped his folder closed. "The structural damage appears worse than expected," he said coolly. "He's quite disconnected." "Thank you, Sterling," Magnus replied. His hand landed on my shoulder again, gripping it tightly. "Let's eat. We have much to discuss about the transition." As we walked to Harlow, the hallway, I slowed my steps slightly, just enough to hear Magnus lean closer to Hayes. His whisper was sharp and quiet. "We need to expedite the medication increase tonight." The words hit me like a blow. The poisoning wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. Ahead of us, the faint clink of silverware echoed from the dining room. Crystal glasses chimed softly as someone arranged the table. I looked at the elegant place settings waiting beneath the chandelier. For Magnus, this wasn't a family dinner. It was a last supper. Walls in a luxury home are designed to insulate, but no amount of high-grade drywall could dampen the sheer, jagged edge of the terror in my daughter's voice. I had avoided the dinner table, claiming a sudden bout of exhaustion, and instead found myself pressed into the shadows of the darkened hallway near the service pantry. I moved with a careful, measured gait, avoiding the sensor zones I had mapped out in my mind. Through the cracked pantry door, I watched as Magnus and Celeste entered the kitchen after seeing Dr. Hayes out. The polished facade of the Charleston power couple disintegrated before my eyes. Magnus's voice dropped to a low, vibrating growl, a tone I had never heard him use in public, stripped of all hedge fund charm and false empathy. "You're getting soft, Celeste," he hissed, and I could hear the vibration of the heavy kitchen door closing behind them. "I saw your hand shaking when you poured his tea." Magnus revealed then that he had been secretly recording Celeste's confessions of guilt as insurance, proving he never intended for her to be his partner, but merely his fall guy if the architecture of his lies ever collapsed. "He's my father, Magnus," she whispered, her voice reflecting in the stainless steel fridge as a distorted, shimmering ghost. "He looks so small. Are we really doing this? I raising a daughter, but he had turned her into a ghost." His anger wasn't an explosion. It was a slow-acting acid eating away at her, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of the girl I used to walk to school. Magnus trapped her against the counter, and I heard the sharp, violent clink of a glass being slammed onto the quartz. He reminded her of the dangerous people expecting their money by Friday, and how her name was on every fraudulent withdrawal from my accounts. He framed my death as her only path to staying out of prison and keeping her children. "If we stop now, the bank takes the house on Monday, and the SEC takes me on Tuesday." He said, "Where do you think that leaves you and the kids? How do you save someone who is holding the very hand that's strangling them?" "Please," she begged, her spirit visibly snapping. "Don't hurt him anymore. Just let the doctor handle the papers." Magnus merely laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. He mentioned a boating trip for the weekend, the same method he used to kill Margaret Thornton, and I realized my execution date was set for the next 48 hours. I felt a surge of paternal protective rage, realizing I had to destroy my own daughter's marriage to save her life from this actuary of murder. I watched her through the gap as she collapsed into a chair, her shoulders heaving with silent, broken sobs that smelled of cold coffee and floor wax. She was a hostage to her own vanity and his malice. The sharp, rhythmic whistling of Magnus began as he walked away, a tune I recognized with a shiver from Helen's funeral. The sound of Celeste's spirit breaking was quieter than I expected. But as Magnus's footsteps faded, I knew the clock hadn't just started, it was about to strike midnight. I remained in the dark, my heart a heavy stone of resolve, knowing the river was calling for me once again. The soft creak of the studio door and the smell of oil paints and despair followed me as I stepped into my daughter's private sanctuary. Walking into Celeste's studio was like stepping into a cathedral of denial, where every swatch of silk and marble tile was a prayer meant to drown out the sound of her own conscience. I found her frantically rearranging mood boards, her movements jerky and desperate, as if she were trying to physically reorder a world that was falling apart. I realized then that she hadn't just been spending the money. She'd been funneled into a silent partnership in a shell company that Marcus Webb used for money laundering. A deeper rot than I had ever imagined. I chose to abandon the agitated persona Magnus expected. "I know you're in there, Celeste," I said, my voice cutting through the clinical silence. Not the designer, not the accomplice. My daughter. She flinched, her hands clutching a fabric swatch as if it were a life preserver. "Dad, please." Magnus said you'd get like this. "You need your medicine." I ignored the tea tray and the luxury finishes of the room, the granite and gold that served as the walls of her own prison. "I know about the $250,000 debt you personally signed for and the forgery at the hospital." I was trying to shore up a load-bearing wall that had already been turned to sawdust by termites of her own making. "Grace isn't about what you deserve, Celeste. It's about what you choose to protect now. Help me save Milo and Lark, and I will forgive it all. I will protect you from the police, but only if you help me expose him." "It's too late," she whispered, the wet, gasping sound of her breath filling the space between us. "The papers are already filed. I'm part of it, Dad. I'm the one who signed. The mirror didn't lie. She saw a criminal. I saw my little girl drowning in a sea of gold-plated lies." She caught her own reflection in a large silver-framed mirror and recoiled, the distortion of her face in the polished surface matching the ruin in her heart. "Could you truly forgive a mistake this big?" she asked, her voice a fragile reed. "I already have," I replied, my heart breaking for the legacy we had lost. "But the law won't." I stood among her expensive samples, a silent witness to her collapse. She didn't choose the light. She chose the fear. Celeste fled the studio, sobbing into her hands, leaving me alone with the rhythmic ticking of the minimalist studio clock. As she ran out, a single document fluttered from her desk and landed at my feet. I picked up the paper, expecting another bill or a design spec, but it was an itinerary for a boating trip. My eyes locked onto the time printed in bold, 5 p.m. Not this weekend. Today. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. I looked at the studio clock. It was already 9:30. I had less than 8 hours to live. Magnus had planned the boating trip as his primary execution method, the same technique he'd used on Margaret Thornton. But the moment we arrived at the precinct, he knew the timeline had collapsed. The GPS tracker in Helen's ring betrayed our location, forcing him to abandon the slow, calculated drowning for something more desperate: hostages. The children weren't part of his original plan. They were his emergency exit strategy when the architecture of his lies began to crumble. The silent house around me no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a tomb being sealed in real time. I had to move, and I had to move now before the tide of Magnus's final plan washed over the last of my family's foundations. 8 hours left to live. That was the silent calculation running through my mind as I stood alone in the studio. My survival now depended on something no larger than my thumbnail, a small piece of plastic, and the bravery of a boy who should never have needed to learn how to hide evidence from his own father. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly each second, striking my nerves like a hammer. Then I heard footsteps, fast, uneven. Milo burst into the room, his sneakers slapping against the wooden floor. He looked breathless, pale, and terrified. His hands trembled as he dug into his pocket. "I found it, Grandpa," he whispered. He placed a rugged USB drive in my palm. The faint smell of dust and damp drywall clung to his hair. It was hidden in the office. Inside a hollowed-out book, he continued quietly. The emails? They've been planning the boating trip since before the river. For a moment, I simply stared at him. A wave of fierce, protective love surged through me, mixed with a colder emotion. Rage. You did well, Milo, I said softly. Then I lowered my voice. Listen carefully. If something happens to me today, you must get this drive to Jim Rodriguez. I reached into my drafting kit and pulled out the small tablet I had been hiding. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the room as I inserted the drive. The files opened instantly. What I saw made my chest tighten. Legal documents, contracts, emails, every one of them drafted by Marcus Webb. The evidence revealed something even worse than legal fraud. Marcus Webb wasn't just Magnus's lawyer. He was Magnus's brother. This wasn't just corruption. It was a family conspiracy. Together they had constructed a systematic plan to dismantle everything I had built in my life. My architectural firm, my investments, my estate, even my death had been calculated. I scrolled through the documents slowly. One email confirmed Magnus's intention to settle a massive high-interest debt using the payout from my life insurance policy. My death had already been budgeted. They've already spent my life twice over, I murmured. Milo stood quietly beside me. How many files does it take to document the betrayal of a father? I said softly. The answer was chilling. Not many. Suddenly I heard the sound of tires outside, gravel crunching, a vehicle pulling into the driveway, Magnus's SUV. The timeline was collapsing. I couldn't risk keeping the drive with me during the upcoming evaluation or whatever trip Magnus had planned next. My eyes scanned the studio walls. Then I saw it, a structural support beam hidden behind the wall paneling. Quick, Milo, I whispered sharply, under the header beam. They'll never think to search the structure. With Milo's help, I slipped the USB drive behind the steel support and secured it in place with a magnetic strip from my drafting tools. The small device disappeared into the frame of the house, hidden within the bones of the building itself, a flash drive, a digital grenade, powerful enough to destroy Magnus's empire, but only if I lived long enough to detonate it. As I stepped back from the wall, a notification suddenly appeared on the tablet screen. My blood ran cold. Magnus had installed a GPS tracker inside my wedding ring, the same ring Celeste had taken earlier for safekeeping. They weren't just controlling my life. They were tracking my movements through the last piece of Helen I still carried. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a cage. Every sound, every movement, every memory, mapped and monitored. My fingers hurried across the tablet screen as I tried to shut it down. Footsteps approached the studio door. Closer. The handle began to turn. The heavy mahogany door creaked softly, almost like a warning. I looked down. The tablet was still in my hand. Panic surged through my chest. Light from the hallway spilled slowly into the room, widening across the floor like a spotlight exposing a crime scene. I moved quickly. The tablet disappeared beneath a pile of silk fabric samples spread across the work table. My heart pounded violently against my ribs. Then I turned to Harlow the door. The latch clicked open. I shoved the tablet beneath a stack of old blueprints a heartbeat. Before the door slammed open, my pulse hammering against my ribs, like a trapped bird sensing the cat's shadow. Magnus entered the studio, his tailored silhouette blocking out the hall light. His eyes cold and restless, immediately began a surgical scan of the room, looking for Milo or any misplaced thread of evidence. "You're wandering again, Dorian," he said, his voice carrying that smooth hedge fund arrogance I had grown to loathe. "This isn't your room." I let my mouth hang open slightly, assuming the vacant mask of the drifting elder. The headers. "They're steel, aren't they?" I rambled, gesturing to Harlow the structural beam, where the USB drive was hidden. "Good for the weight. Very good for the weight." He sneered, checking the temperature of the air, as if he could sense my panic. Just then my phone, which Milo had miraculously recharged in secret, vibrated in my pocket. I realized then that Detective Morrison wasn't just calling about the railing. Jim Rodriguez had actually filmed the push on his phone, but was too afraid to come for Harlow until he saw Magnus's SUV again. The phone's vibration felt like a lightning strike in a room made of dry timber, dangerous, unexpected, and the only thing that could clear the air. I pulled it out with cold, slick fingers and answered. "Mr. Rowan. This is Detective Morrison. We found traces of acid on the bolts. We need to talk." Detective Morrison's voice was like seasoned oak rough solid and carrying the weight of 20 years of Charleston's darkest secrets. My heart leaped, but I saw Magnus stepping to Harlow the doorway, leaning against the frame to listen. Yes, I remember the water, I croaked, keeping my tone vague and confused. It was so cold. Have you ever held a conversation knowing that every word you spoke was a brick being laid in the wall of your own defense? I could feel Magnus's predatory gaze on my back, a physical pressure. I knew I had to schedule a meeting without alerting him to the fact that I was fully sane. Tomorrow at 9, I asked the detective, making it sound like I was talking to an architect. Yes, the blueprints, I'll be there. I hung up my hand, trembling as I turned to face my son-in-law. Who was that? Dorian Magnus asked, his voice a low, vibrating threat. You shouldn't be taking calls alone. Just a man. Asking about the blueprints, I replied, staring past him. He said the railing was broken. I saw then what he was carrying in his left hand, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. The smell of metal and lubricant from the tool filled the small space, a sharp, industrial scent that signaled his intent to destroy any remaining structural evidence, or perhaps to silence the man who knew too much. He didn't say another word, but he slowly tapped the steel jaws of the bolt cutters against the doorframe, the rhythmic clack sounding like a judge's gavel. His eyes promised that I would never make it to that 9 o'clock appointment. The shadow of his frame stretched across the floor, reaching for me like a dark tide. I stood my ground, the cold sweat slicking my phone's casing, knowing the final structural failure of our family was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. Reading the truth about how my daughter was hunted wasn't like reading a diary. It was like reviewing the structural stress tests of a building designed specifically to collapse with her inside. I retreated to the dimmest corner of my attic room, the blue light of the tablet searing into my tired eyes as the cooling fan whirred a frantic mechanical prayer. I opened the file titled Project L on the flash drive, which Milo had recovered from the office. It was a terrifyingly detailed timeline starting from 2019, documenting Celeste's deepest insecurities, her favorite luxury brands, and the raw, jagged edges of her grief over Helen. Magnus had noted exactly when to provide emotional support, and exactly when to introduce the seductive lure of offshore investments. Every romantic milestone in their marriage was a calculated financial maneuver. Target demonstrates high attachment to status symbols. I read the words a cold grease on my palm. Use debt to ensure compliance. He wasn't her husband. He was her Harlowan. His words were like termites in the beams of our family tree, quiet and visible, and dedicated to turning our history into dust. I discovered that Magnus was actually the anonymous tipster who reported my architectural firm for a minor building code violation in 2020. He had done it specifically to create the first seed of confusion in my professional record, a crack in the foundation he intended to widen. The journal detailed his efforts to isolate Celeste from her old friends and from me, manufacturing misunderstandings and forgotten phone calls to make her believe I was losing my mind years before the river incident. He made her choose between her vanity and her father, and he made sure vanity won every time. The nauseating smell of the chemical paint in the small room seemed to thicken with every sentence I scrolled through. The last entries detailed the Dorian Rowan liquidation. Magnus had calculated the exact date his hedge fund's debt would go public and set my accidental death for 3 days prior. How do you breathe when you realize the man tucking your grandchildren into bed is the same man who has already priced their silence? The journal ended with a chilling one-line entry about Milo and Lark suggesting they would be sent to a boarding facility in Marcus Webb's name once the insurance cleared. He was going to sell my grandchildren to pay for his mistakes. The vibration of my own heart thudded in my ears as I reached the final digital folder. It contained a copy of a letter Magnus wrote to be found after my death, a forged suicide note that blamed my unbearable dementia for my choice to end my life in the river. It was a perfect mimicry of my signature, a final professional insult from a predator who saw people as mere building materials. I felt physically ill, a cold sweat slicking my skin, as I realized the systematic nature of his grooming. I wasn't just a victim, I was a line item being crossed off. I stared at the forged suicide note on the screen, my own signature perfectly mimicked at the bottom, and then I heard the heavy, deliberate tread of Magnus's shoes stopping directly outside my door. He didn't knock. He simply stood there, a shadow against the threshold, and I knew the blueprints for the final confrontation were already in his hand. The gray, soupy light of a Charleston dawn crept through the attic window, and the sound of a zipper on a duffel bag downstairs signaled that the final phase had begun. I shoved the tablet deep into my waistband, the cold metal, a sharp reminder of the evidence I carried. Magnus ushered me to the SUV with high-spirited energy that made my skin crawl. He was talking about the boating trip, as if it were a re-Harlow for my recovery rather than a planned execution. Celesta stood by the driver's side, her hands gripping the door handle so hard her knuckles were white. Magnus leaned in, his voice full of that hollow practice charm. "Drive safe, Lee. Make sure Dad stays comfortable. I'll meet you at the marina in 20. I have him, Magnus. Just go." She whispered, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. I noticed then that she had already packed a run bag for herself and the kids weeks ago, hidden beneath a spare tire cover, proving she had been subconsciously preparing for Magnus's turn to Harlow violence. The smell of leather and expensive perfume in the SUV was suffocating as we pulled out of the driveway. I watched Magnus in the rearview mirror, standing with Marcus Webb as they watched us depart. For a few miles, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal. Then, as the vibration of the Ravenel Bridge began to thrum through the tires, I dropped the mask. "I know about the note, Celeste," I said, my voice steady and clear. "He wrote a suicide note in my handwriting. He was never going to let you keep the children." She gasped, nearly swerving into the next lane, as the sun reflected off the harbor water with a blinding glare. The Ravenel Bridge felt like a tightrope stretched over an abyss, and Celeste was the one swaying in the wind while I held the only safety line left. "Daddy, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her frantic, shallow breathing filling the cabin. I thought it was just the money. I saw the kerosene receipt, but I was too scared. I reached out and put my hand over hers on the steering wheel. "Grace isn't about what you deserve, Celeste. It's about what you choose to protect now. He has a GPS tracker in my wedding ring. He's watching us right now. What is the sound of a lifelong lie finally snapping? It's quieter than you'd think. It sounds like a turn signal clicking in the dark." As we reached the end of the bridge, her phone buzzed with a text from Magnus, but she didn't look at it. "Turn the wheel, Celeste," I commanded. "End this structure before it kills us all." With a violent yank, she steered the SUV to Harlow, the downtown precinct exit. "Tell them everything," she whispered, "even the parts that send me to jail." As we pulled into the police station parking lot, I felt a surge of grim relief. Jim Rodriguez's truck was already parked near the entrance, indicating the swimmer had arrived to deliver the video evidence of the push. Celeste killed the engine and rested her forehead against the wheel, her body shaking with the weight of her choice. "He's going to kill me for this, isn't he?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper that broke the last of my heart. But before I could answer, my phone vibrated with a violence that made my entire body jolt. The unknown number flashed across the cracked screen. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but something an architect's instinct for structural failure made me answer. The voice that filled my ear wasn't Magnus's smooth hedge fund charm. It was the raw, stripped-down sound of a man whose empire was collapsing in real time, and he was looking for someone to bury in the rubble. "Hello, Dorian." Magnus said, his voice a low, vibrating threat that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I hear you've been having conversations with people who don't understand our family's business." The cold, metallic taste of fear flooded my mouth as I realized he knew we were at the precinct. The GPS tracker in Helen's wedding ring had betrayed us. I could hear the rhythmic sound of traffic in the background, the distinctive whoosh of Highway 17, and I knew he wasn't at the marina. He was mobile hunting. "Magnus," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the hammer of my pulse, "if you're calling to apologize for the river, you're a few weeks late." His laugh was a dry, rattling sound that carried no humor. "Apologize, no, Dorian. I'm calling to give you a choice. You can stop this investigation, or you can keep playing detective, and we'll see how well you swim when the current is twice as strong." The threat was clear, but it was the background noise that made my blood freeze. I heard a child's voice, Lark's high-pitched giggle, and the distinctive electronic chime of a school bell. "Where are you, Magnus?" I demanded, my voice rising. His silence was a physical weight pressing against my chest. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Dorian. Just remember, foundations crumble faster when you remove the wrong support beam. Think about which beams you're willing to lose." The line went dead, leaving only the hollow echo of his threat hanging in the air. I looked at Celeste, her face drained of color. "He's at the school," I whispered. "He's taking the children." We burst through the precinct doors, Celeste screaming for Detective Morrison as I recounted the call. The smell of jasmine from the garden outside mixed with the acrid taste of adrenaline as Morrison immediately radioed dispatch. The call wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration of war, and the battlefield was about to expand beyond anything I had anticipated. As sirens began to wail in the distance, I knew the structure of our family was about to face its final stress test. The smell of the precinct was a mixture of floor wax and stale coffee, a sterile scent that felt like the first breath of clean air I'd taken since the river had tried to claim me. I walked through the heavy glass doors with Celeste, the cold air-conditioned draft in the interview room, raising the hair on my arms. Detective Morrison greeted us in a windowless space, his face set in a grim mask. I didn't waste time on tears. I started with structural proof. I laid out the dry cleaning receipt with its telltale river silt and the symptom log containing Marcus Webb's handwritten triggers. Morrison revealed that Jim Rodriguez's video didn't just show the push. It showed Magnus returning to the railing 10 minutes later with a vial of acid to finish dissolving the bolts. I'm an architect detective. I know how to read a failure. I said, my voice finally steady. This railing didn't rust. It was assassinated. Morrison nodded slowly, the scratch of his pen on his legal pad, the only other sound. You've brought me a lot more than just a bad memory, Mr. Rowan. I reached into my pocket and produced the ruggedized flash drive. The metallic smell of the evidence bag felt like victory as I handed it over. I explained the email chain between Magnus and Marcus Webb, the liquidation timeline, and the horrific Predator's journal. As the drive was plugged into a workstation, a blue, flickering light from the monitor washed over us. Laying out the evidence was like placing the final stones in a dam. I could feel the current of Magnus's lies finally starting to slow against the weight of the truth. The room went silent as Morrison scrolled through the cold tabulated plans for my death. It's all here, I whispered. The life insurance, the shell companies, and the previous victims. My God, Morrison muttered. He has a spreadsheet for the probate period. A tech specialist with a buzzed haircut and eyes that move faster than the data on his screen, Agent Miller took the drive with a pair of sterile tweezers. He began verifying the digital signatures on the forged power of attorney, while the hum of the precinct's server fans filled the gaps in our conversation. I pulled out my tablet and showed the GPS tracker notification. If the ring is in this building, Magnus knows we're here, I warned. We need to shield that signal. Now. Morrison barked an order to Miller, who moved with sudden frantic energy to isolate the device. How does it feel to see your own life being sold off in a dark web auction, while you're still sitting in a room with the heat on Agent Miller's fingers flew across the keys? He discovered a hidden partition on the flash drive containing live stream credentials for cameras in the Mount Pleasant house. Magnus wasn't just watching me. He was broadcasting my perceived decline to a private bidding group of predatory lenders. Morrison stared at the live camera feed from my bedroom in Mount Pleasant, his face draining of color. My heart stopped as he checked another screen, one tracking the movement of Magnus's own vehicle. If he's not tracking you, he whispered, looking up at me with eyes full of a new sharp panic. Why is he at the school? There is no architectural filter for a father watching his only child dismantle her own life sentence by sentence through the cold transparency of a two-way mirror. I stood in the darkened observation room, the cold, oily feel of the observation glass pressing against my forehead. On the other side of the partition, the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead LED panels washed the color from Celeste's face, making her look like a ghost in her own story. Detective Morrison pivoted with clinical precision, shifting from my ally to her interrogator. I watched her trembling hands reach for a plastic cup of water, her smudged mascara tracing paths of ruin down her cheeks. Celeste revealed then that she had secretly recorded one of Magnus's phone calls with Marcus Webb, where they discussed the final solution for me. She had evidence of the murder plot, a digital recording that could have saved me weeks ago, but she had chosen to hide it out of a paralyzing fear for her own safety. I just wanted the house back. Detective, she whispered, her voice, a muffled echoing quality over the intercom. Magnus said it was just a temporary loan from Dad's estate. Morrison didn't blink. A $250,000 loan, without his consent, is called grand larceny Celeste. The glass between us was more than just silica and lead. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of trust being ground into sand. I watched her break down completely when Morrison slid the power of attorney document across the table. She admitted she knew it wasn't my signature, but she had been convinced by Marcus that it was a legal necessity to protect us from bankruptcy. Magnus hadn't just used her greed. He had used her terror of failure to turn her into a criminal. I didn't know about the river. She wailed, her voice cracking under the scent of ozone from the recording equipment. I swear on my children's lives, I thought he just fell. But you didn't tell the doctors the truth when he tried to speak, did you? Morrison countered. She couldn't answer. She simply stared at the table, a structure collapsed under its own weight. How do you hold the hand of someone who used your own signature to write your obituary? I wanted to reach through the glass to pull her back to the girl who used to sit on my drafting stool. But that girl was gone. Morrison informed her that while her cooperation would be noted, her actions made her a co-conspirator. The realization of a prison sentence finally hit her, and she looked to Harlow, the glass instinctively knowing I was there. "Daddy, are you there? Please." Her eyes were pleading for a structural rescue I could no longer provide. As she was being led out by a uniformed officer, she stopped at the door, whispering one last detail to Morrison. "Magnus has a second untraceable vehicle hidden in a rental lot for emergencies," she said, her voice hollow. "He's going to use it today." Celeste's eyes locked onto mine through the one-way glass, and in that moment, the daughter I knew vanished. Replaced by a woman who realized that her perfect life was actually a prison she had helped build. I remained in the dark, my heart a heavy stone of paternal sorrow, as the weight of her complicity settled over the room like a shroud. The daughter I had built my world around was now a stranger facing the ruins of her own making. The heavy thud of the door closing behind Celeste left a hollow ringing in my ears, soon replaced by the frantic crackle of Morrison's radio. It was a high-priority alert from the school district, a sound that turned my exhausted justice into a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. I stood in the precinct command center, the sharp, stinging smell of fresh printer ink from the newly issued warrants clinging to the air. Detective Morrison's face was grim as he signed the official papers for Magnus Harlow and Marcus Webb. "It's done, Dorian," he said, his voice barely audible over the overlapping barks of police radios. "We have enough for attempted murder and conspiracy." I looked at the ink still glistening on the page. "Just make sure he doesn't see the strike team coming," I warned. "He's a structural thinker. He'll look for the exits before you even reach the driveway." The machinery of justice was finally pivoting, but the structural integrity of my relief collapsed when the desk phone rang. It was the principal of the Children's Academy. Her voice was thin and panicked as she reported that Magnus had arrived 20 minutes ago, claiming I had suffered a massive stroke. He told them he needed to take Milo and Lark to the hospital immediately. Because Celeste had authorized him as the sole decision-maker for school pickups just 2 days after the river incident, they had released my grandchildren into his hands without a single question. "He took them," I shouted, the cold sweat dripping down my neck. "But I'm standing right here, Mr. Rowan, stay calm," Morrison said, though his own jaw was tight. "We're tracking his vehicle now." The warrants were just paper walls, and Magnus had just driven a wrecking ball through the middle of them. I discovered then that the passports were missing from the home safe. He had been planning this escape contingency for weeks. Before I explain what the GPS signal means, I'd love your feedback. How would you rate this story so far from 1 to 10? Leave your rating in the comments. It really helps improve future stories. And a quick note, the next part includes some dramatized details for storytelling. If that's not for you, feel free to stop here. The command center fell into a localized heavy silence as the tech specialist pointed to the monitors. The GPS tracker in the wedding ring showed the vehicle was stationary at a downtown mall Magnus had dumped the anchor. He wasn't running for the state line yet. He was repositioning. Do you know the exact temperature of fear? It's the ice water flash that hits your spine when you realize your grandchildren are in the hands of a man who sees them as bargaining chips. "He's not running, detective," I whispered, my voice cracking. "He's taking hostages. He's using my own flesh and blood as a structural shield." The precinct's televisions all flickered simultaneously to the emergency broadcast, a synchronized pulse of light that made the room feel smaller. There beneath the bold red letters of the Amber Alert were the smiling school photos of Milo and Lark. I stared at their faces, the silence of the command center becoming absolute as every officer held their breath, realizing the man we were hunting had just turned the children into his final exit strategy. The flickering fluorescent lights of the precinct felt like a strobe effect, freezing my daughter's face in a jagged sequence of screams that no amount of luxury or lies could ever silence again. Celeste collapsed in the middle of the squad room, her high-heeled boots slipping on the linoleum as she screamed for her children with raw rhythmic sobbing that tore through the clinical quiet. I gave them to him. She shrieked, her voice a whirlwind of grief and self-loathing. I signed the papers that let him take them. Detective Morrison moved to restrain her, his face a grim mask. "Celeste, look at me," he barked, voice cutting through hysteria. "We need the plate number of that rental car. Focus." I watched from the sidelines, realizing my daughter was finally broken, but the cost of her clarity was the very lives of my grandchildren. The precinct doors slid open, and a bike courier in sweat-stained spandex entered, looking confused by the chaos. He had a package addressed to the architect. Morrison intercepted it inside. Wrapped in a blueprint of the Mount Pleasant estate was Milo's digital watch screen, smashed and frozen at 3 p.m. The sharp metallic scent of blood on the watch glass hit my nostrils. "He sent this to taunt me," I whispered, heart thudding. As Morrison tilted the watch, I saw a tiny bloody fingerprint. It wasn't from Milo, the size was wrong. It was from Lark. My brave little girl had fought back. But it was the soft electronic chime of an iPad notification that cut through the noise like a bell in a cathedral. Agent Miller's head snapped up from his workstation, eyes widening as he stared at tracking software. "We've got something," he said, voice sharp with urgency. "It's coming from a cellular-enabled iPad registered to Emma Harlow." The room fell silent except for server hum and distant police radios. I pushed through the cluster of officers, heart hammering, as I leaned over Miller's shoulder. "What does it say?" Miller's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the notification. It wasn't a standard message, it was a location pin dropped in the Find My Friends app, the kind of breadcrumb a smart child would leave when she knew her phone had been taken. Attached was a single line of text typed with careful precision: "Blue Heron Motel, Highway 17 North, Room 14. The message was time-stamped 3 minutes ago, and below was a second line that made my blood run cold. "Grandpa, he has a knife. Please hurry." "That's my girl," I whispered, voice breaking with pride and terror. "She's telling us where they are." Morrison was already on his radio, barking orders. "All units, we have a confirmed location. Blue Heron Motel, Highway 17, North Room 14. Suspect is armed with a blade holding 2 juvenile hostages. Code 3 response, but maintain perimeter. No sirens within half mile. I need SWAT mobilized now." The room exploded into motion, but I stood frozen. The Blue Heron Motel was a relic from Charleston's past, a 2-story roadside motel on the edge of condemnation. I knew it well. My firm had assessed its structural integrity in the 90s. The building was a death trap of rotting wood and failing supports, and Magnus had chosen it for exactly that reason. "How long until SWAT arrives?" I asked. Miller checked his screen. 12 minutes, sir. Maybe 15 with traffic." 12 minutes was an eternity for 2 children trapped with a man willing to kill. I looked at Morrison, resolve hardening. "I'm going with you, and I'm going in first." Morrison opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "He knows me, detective. If you send in a badge, he'll panic, but if I walk through that door, he'll think he still has control." Morrison stared at me, then nodded. "You wear a vest, and you follow my lead. The second I give the signal, you drop to the floor." "Understood." As we rushed to Harlow, the parking lot, I looked at Emma's message one more time. She had given me the blueprint. Now I had to execute the rescue. The Blue Heron Motel wasn't a landmark. It was a tombstone marking the death of Charleston's roadside glory. A 2-story relic with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a dying insect. As Morrison's cruiser skidded into the gravel parking lot, the smell of hot asphalt and stale exhaust mixed with salt breeze from the marsh beyond. I stepped out the bulletproof vest they'd forced me into feeling like a cage and stared up at the second-floor walkway where Room 14 sat like a dark, unblinking eye. The motel was structural decay, incarnate rusted railings, cracked concrete windows covered with sun-bleached curtains. It was exactly where a desperate man would make his final stand. SWAT had established a perimeter, black-clad forms moving like shadows as they positioned behind vehicles and along the exterior stairwell. Morrison gripped my shoulder. "He's in room 14, second floor, northeast corner. Curtains drawn, no movement, but thermal shows. 3 signatures, 2 small, 1 adult." Relief that my grandchildren were alive was crushed by knowledge of what Magnus could do when cornered. How do you negotiate with a man who sees humans as line items on a balance sheet? Morrison's radio crackled. "All units in position. Snipers on adjacent building have a clear line to the window, but can't get a shot without risking the children. Recommend contact and negotiation." Morrison turned to me. "This is your play, Dorian. Walk up, knock, keep him talking. The second he lowers that knife or moves from the kids, we breach. But if he makes a move, you hit the floor." I adjusted the vest, feeling the concealed wire taped to my chest. The microphone was cold against my skin, a reminder that every word would be heard by officers waiting for their cue. I began the long walk across the parking lot, footsteps crunching on gravel, The afternoon sun was brutal, reflecting off metal railings. As I climbed the stairs, each step groaned. I noticed cigarette butts crushed in corners, a child's toy near room 12, the smell of mildew and cheap disinfectant. When I reached the walkway, I saw the door faded teal paint, tarnished brass number, hanging askew. I paused, hand hovering, and took a breath. A television filtered through the walls, news discussing the Amber Alert with my grandchildren's faces. "Magnus," I called out, voice steady despite adrenaline. "It's Dorian. I'm alone. No police, no weapons. I just want to talk." Silence was a living weight, suffocating. Then the metallic click of a deadbolt withdrawing, and the door cracked open. Magnus's face appeared in the gap, and I barely recognized him. The expensive running gear was gone, replaced by a rumpled shirt stained with sweat. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, the polished manager stripped away to reveal a hollow shell. "You shouldn't have come, Dorian," he whispered. "This could have ended cleanly. Now you're making it worse." Behind him I glimpsed Milo and Lark huddled on the far bed, faces pale with terror. The structural walls of my resolve solidified as I looked into my grandchildren's eyes and knew that whatever happened next, I would not let this man take them from me. The motel room was a capsule of desperation, air thick with stale cigarettes and fear. I stepped across the threshold, eyes locking onto Milo and Lark on the far bed. They were alive, but terror in their eyes was a knife twisting in my chest. Magnus closed the door with a soft click, the deadbolt sliding home with finality. The room was exactly what I'd expected. 2 sagging beds with faded floral bedspreads, a battered nightstand, a small table near the window where Magnus had set up his command center. His laptop displayed live news coverage, and beside it lay a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade gleaming under fluorescent light. "Don't move," Grandpa Milo whispered. "He has the knife." I raised my hands, slowly, palms out. I could feel the wire pressing against my chest microphone, picking up every word from Morrison's team outside. "I'm not here to fight you, Magnus. I'm here because you called me to the river once, and now I'm calling you back to dry ground." Magnus's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Doesn't have to end, Dorian. It already ended. The fund is gone. Marcus is gone. Celeste's testimony destroyed everything. All I have left is leverage." He gestured to Harlow, the children with the knife blade catching light sickeningly. I took a careful step closer, positioning myself between Magnus and the kids. The floor creaked, a reminder that this structure, both building and situation, was on the verge of collapse. "You think they're leverage?" I kept my tone conversational. "Magnus, they're your stepchildren. You tucked them in, went to their school plays. Somewhere you must have felt something." His face twisted. "I felt bored, Dorian, like I was babysitting someone else's mistakes while waiting for the payout. Do you know what it's like to smile at a child when all you see is a decimal point?" The casual cruelty hit like a physical blow, but I stayed calm. I needed him talking, giving SWAT time to position. Through the curtain gap, I caught a glimpse of a black-clad figure on the exterior walkway. They were getting into position, but the room's layout made a clean shot impossible. Magnus stood too close to the window. "You're right, Magnus. I underestimated you. Margaret, Susan, even me. You're a builder like I am. You just build with different materials." His eyes narrowed. "What are you saying? I'm saying you win. You want leverage, take me. Let the kids go and I'll be your hostage. I'm worth more alive. I'll sign whatever you want. Just let them walk out." For a moment, calculation flickered across his face. But then Milo spoke, young voice cutting through tension. "Don't listen to him, Magnus. Grandpa's wired. The cops are right outside." My blood turned to ice as Magnus's gaze snapped to my chest, eyes widening. The boy had just thrown a grenade into the negotiation. Magnus's face contorted with rage as he lunged, knife raised, and the careful architecture of the standoff collapsed into chaos. Outside, Morrison's voice crackled over megaphone, "Magnus Harlow. This is Charleston Police. Release the hostages and surrender. You are surrounded." Boots thundered up the exterior stairs, and I realized the breach was coming, whether we were ready or not. The fluorescent light flickered, casting jagged shadows, and I saw Magnus's eyes lock onto mine with terrible clarity. He wasn't going to surrender. He was going to take as many down as he could. Time didn't slow. It fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. Magnus's lunge was a blur, the hunting knife arcing through stale air with lethal intent. I threw myself back Harlow's shoulder, slamming into the cheap dresser as the blade whistled past my face close enough that I felt air displacement. Behind me, Lark screamed high and piercing, freezing Magnus for a heartbeat. That moment was all Milo needed. The boy launched from the bed, colliding with Magnus's legs in a desperate tackle that sent him stumbling. The knife clattered across the floor, skittering under the bed, and I heard the most beautiful sound, the splintering crack of the door being blown off its hinges. Breach, 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 SWAT flooded in like a black tide boots thundering. Flash grenades detonated with blinding light and concussive blast that rattled my teeth. I dropped to the floor, covering my head, as the world became chaos, shouted commands and acrid smoke. Get down, get on the ground, hands where we can see them. Magnus's scream of rage cut short as officers tackled him, their weight driving him into carpet, zip ties ratcheted tight, then Morrison's voice, secure the suspect, get the children out. Clear the room. Strong hands pulled me up, guiding me to Harlow the door. Through smoke I saw Milo and Lark being carried out by officers wrapped in protective arms. Grandpa Lark's voice cut through noise. I'm here, sweetheart, I called, voice breaking. You're safe now. As I was led onto the walkway, afternoon sun hit like a physical blow. The parking lot was a sea of flashing lights, patrol cars, ambulances, fire trucks converging on this roadside pocket where our darkest chapter had reached its conclusion. Behind me, Magnus's voice raw and stripped. You don't understand, he screamed as they dragged him out. I needed that money. The fund was collapsing. I had no choice. Morrison appeared at my side, hand gripping my shoulder. You had a choice, Magnus. You chose to be a predator. Now you live with consequences. As Magnus was hauled downstairs, I caught one last glimpse of his face. The polished manager, the charming son-in-law, the man who'd stood at my daughter's wedding, all gone. What remained was hollow shell, a structure rotten from the foundation up. Medics swarmed Milo and Lark while I stood on the walkway, legs weak. Morrison guided me to sit on the top step metal railing, cool under my palm. You did good, Dorian. You kept him talking long enough for us to position. If you hadn't walked through that door, this could have ended differently. I looked down at the parking lot where Magnus was being loaded into a patrol car, hands cuffed. The hunting knife had been bagged as evidence, blade still gleaming. I thought about Margaret and Susan, names reduced to line items. I thought about the river and the push. And I thought about 2 children in the ambulance alive because a 12-year-old had been brave enough to tackle a monster. Celeste arrived moments later, car screeching to a halt at the perimeter. She ran to Harlow, the ambulance face a mask of anguish and relief as she gathered Milo and Lark into her arms. I watched as she collapsed to her knees, sobbing into their hair, and I knew that whatever trials awaited her, this reunion was the first honest thing she'd done in years. As the sun dipped to Harlow, the horizon, I made my way down the stairs. Each step felt heavy, the weight of everything pressing down. But when I reached the bottom and felt solid ground beneath my feet, I realized I was still standing. The structure of my life had been tested, cracked, nearly destroyed, but the foundation had held. They say justice is blind, but as I walked into that courtroom, I realized she was also cold efficient and entirely indifferent to the fact she was tearing the last of my family apart. I stepped into Charleston County Courthouse, air thick with floor wax and old paper footsteps echoing against high ceilings. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across polished marble. Judge Holloway sat behind the bench like a gargoyle of law eyes weathered by decades of seeing Charleston's worst. I sat in the front row as Magnus Harlow was led in, stripped of designer suits and swagger. He wore standard orange that looked like a structural defect against mahogany paneling. The prosecution presented the Predator's journal and Milo's recordings, painting a picture of a man who treated homicide as line item expense. They detailed Margaret Thornton's boating accident, Susan Whitfield's drowning, and the meticulous planning of my attempted murder. The courtroom fell silent as they played audio of Magnus's motel confession. I did what was necessary for the fund. You don't build a legacy, mister. Harlow Judge Holloway said, voice a low, gravelly vibration. You build a cemetery. Magnus refused to look at me, jaw set in final arrogance. The sharp clack of the gavel sounded like a demolition ball. Life without the possibility of parole. The second trial followed immediately, cutting deeper. Marcus Webb, Magnus's biological brother and co-conspirator, was led in wearing chains. The corrupt lawyer had been apprehended at Atlanta Airport, attempting to board a flight to the Caymans with $3 million in cryptocurrency. His arrest had been swift. Morrison's coordination with federal marshals. Webb's face was resigned as charges were read: conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse fraud, money laundering obstruction. Evidence was overwhelming: forged power of attorney shell companies, notarized documents that nearly stripped me of everything. He didn't fight. He simply sat as his attorney negotiated a plea deal for testimony against Magnus. 15 years, Judge Holloway announced gavel striking. No parole eligibility for the first 10. As Webb was led away, he glanced at me, and I saw not remorse, but cold acknowledgement that he'd been outplayed. The prosecution also brought charges against Dr. Sterling Hayes, the cognitive consultant Magnus had paid to fabricate my incompetency evaluation. Hayes's medical license was permanently revoked by the South Carolina Board of Medical Examiners, and he received a 3-year suspended sentence for professional misconduct and conspiracy to commit fraud. The watch he'd worn Magnus's hedge fund merchandise was entered into evidence as proof of their financial relationship. Justice, it seemed, had a long memory for those who weaponized medicine against the vulnerable. The tone shifted to profound tragedy as Celeste took the stand. She looked a shell designer clothes replaced by simple gray dress face bare of makeup. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy, grand larceny, elder abuse, voice barely a whisper as she recounted her role. I wanted the life he promised. I didn't care who I had to step on, even my own father. I sat and watched my daughter accept responsibility for crimes that would cost 7 years, and I felt the weight of every parental decision pressing down. Despite her cooperation, testimony securing Magnus's conviction, her role in the motel, the scale was too great. 7 years, Judge Holloway said, voice softening slightly, with credit for time served and parole possibility after 5 contingent on demonstrated rehabilitation. I watched her being handcuffed silver bracelets, a cruel echo of designer watches she once coveted. As she was let out, she turned one last time. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she mouthed, tears streaming. I nodded, unable to speak. After adjournment, Morrison handed me a heavy folder containing court-ordered restitution and Mount Pleasant estate dissolution. I was granted full permanent guardianship of Milo and Lark, marking the start of a different architectural project, one requiring patience, love, and foundation, built on honesty rather than gold. "They're safe now," Dorian Morrison said on the courthouse steps, "but they're going to need shoring up." I looked at the folder, then at the empty space where my daughter had stood, and realized the hardest part of being an architect wasn't the building. It was knowing which parts of a ruin were worth saving. I spent the morning checking railings on the back porch, not because I didn't trust the wood, but because verifying every support beam had become the only way I knew how to breathe. 6 months had passed since the trials. 6 months of learning to be a full-time guardian while carrying the weight of a daughter locked behind bars. The visiting room at Leith Correctional Institution smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. I sat at a small metal table, hands folded, waiting for the guard to bring Celeste out. Milo and Lark sat beside me, young faces tense. "It's okay to be nervous," I told them quietly. "She's going to look different, but she's still your mom." The door buzzed open and Celeste walked in. The transformation was structural designer labels gone, replaced by standard beige uniform. Her hair was pulled back, face bare, eyes carrying a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "Daddy," she whispered, voice breaking. "I didn't think you'd come." Milo and Lark launched themselves at the plexiglass barrier, hands pressed against the surface. "Mom, we missed you." Celeste pressed her own hands against the glass, matching their small palms. "I missed you too, babies, every single day." The guard allowed a brief contact visit, a privilege earned through good behavior. She hugged Milo and Lark with a desperation that spoke of 6 months separation. When she released them, she turned to me. "I don't know how to start, Dad. I don't know how to apologize." "Forgiveness isn't a sudden coat of paint," Celeste, I replied, taking her hand. "It's the slow process of sanding down old layers until you find smooth wood underneath." She told me about the forensic accounting degree, the therapy sessions confronting the materialism that made her vulnerable. "I want to help people like you, Dad. Track down predators so no one else goes through this." Celeste pulled out a handwritten letter, hands shaking. She read aloud a detailed accounting of every decision, every forged signature, every moment she'd chosen silence over truth. Not an excuse, a confession. At the end, she looked directly at me. "I chose the gold over you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving I understand what I lost." I reached into my jacket and pulled out Helen's note. "Your mother knew Celeste," I said quietly. She saw the shadows in Magnus's eyes before any of us did. Celeste unfolded it with trembling hands, reading the elegant script, "Don't let our daughter lose her way in the shadows." Tears streamed as she pressed it to her chest. "Mom tried to save me," she whispered, "and I didn't listen." As the guard signaled time was up, Milo handed his mother a drawing, a sketch of the Trad Street house with all of us on the porch, including a small figure labeled, "Mom coming home soon." Celeste held it to her chest. "I'll be home. And when I am, I'll be the mother you deserve." As we walked out into bright November sun, Lark slipped her hand into mine. "Do you think she meant it, Grandpa?" I looked back at the gray concrete building, then down at her hopeful face. "I think she's finally building a foundation worth standing on." 3 years later, I stood at the water's edge, fingers tracing the cold, reinforced steel of the new railing along the Ashley River Promenade. A small memorial plaque honored Margaret and Susan, the women Magnus had treated like disposable scaffolding. The double-bolted supports were exactly what I had recommended. You can't stop the tide, but you can make sure the pilings are deep enough to hold. Never let them tell you that your years have made you weak. Your years are your reinforcement. I reflected on the true meaning of family structure, thinking of Milo's keen eye and Lark's resilience. They were the load-bearing beams of a future that a predator tried to demolish. Even Celeste's scars were part of the foundation now. The oldest buildings know how to survive the storm. I looked out at the Charleston winter sunset, the sky turning deep purple. I have signed over the Rowan firm to Milo, ensuring the legacy continues through the boy who saw the first crack in the wall. Life isn't a finished drawing. It's a constant revision of blueprints until the structure can stand on its own. I turned my back on the river and walked to Harlow, the light of my home, knowing that while the water would always be there, I finally knew how to build a bridge that would never break. Looking back now, I understand this was never only about survival. It became a painful family story about blindness, pride, and the quiet danger of trusting the wrong people simply because they share your blood. For many years, I believed providing for my family was enough. I thought love, silence, and patience would somehow keep everything standing. But this family story taught me something simple and difficult. At the same time, when respect disappears, the foundation of a family has already begun to crack. And in cases of family betrayal, those cracks spread faster than we ever expect. If there is one lesson hidden inside this family story, it is this: never ignore the warning signs, just because the person hurting you carries the same last name. Some people watching might describe what happened as revenge. Others might call it justice after deep family betrayal. But in my heart, it never felt like revenge. Real revenge grows from anger and bitterness. What I chose instead was something much harder: boundaries, truth, and the courage to stand up before everything collapsed completely. If there is one mistake I hope you never repeat from my journey, it is sacrificing your dignity just to keep the peace. When betrayal hides behind polite smiles and shared memories, silence only gives it more power. Protecting the innocent and refusing to let evil hide behind the word family was the only choice I could live with. I also learned something deeper about faith. There were moments when I truly believed the river would become the final page of my family's story, yet somehow the truth surfaced at exactly the moment it needed to. I believe God has a way of revealing what is hidden when the time is right, even when darkness seems stronger. Thank you for walking with me all the way to the end of this journey. I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you faced the same impossible situation? Your perspective means more than you might realize. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Just a gentle reminder, while this narrative explores real-world themes, some details were dramatized to strengthen the storytelling experience. If this kind of story isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that might suit you better.